The RX 6800 XT is a 1440p monster. You might even consider buying it over the RTX 3080 if you're primarily interested in high refresh rate 1440p gaming. These might be the people who are super competitive esports players, that type of thing. Or you might be like me and just in the current market you found one for significantly less money than a 3080. But in this video I'm talking mainly to those people, the people who are the high refresh rate 1440p gamers, mainly focused on that, so you bought a 6800 XT, or maybe you're considering buying a 6800 XT, by the way. But what if you're like, well, I do sometimes play some single player games where I do crank the graphics settings up, and if there's ray tracing, I might be interested in trying it out. So we all know that the 3080 is going to give you a much better ray tracing experience than the 6800 XT. So in this video, I'm not looking at comparing the 6800 XT to the 3080. That's pointless. I'll tell you right now, the 3080 will crush it at ray tracing. Instead, what I'm looking at is, what if you wanted to play some single player games and play around with a bit of ray tracing? If you kick it on, is the game still playable? Can you reach acceptable, which I would define as around 60 frames per second, maybe a little bit lower if you're on a variable refresh rate monitor, where that can kind of smooth out those transitions. And can we get that? And the games I'm testing are just 6 ray tracing games that I happen to already own. So let's jump into some of that testing and then I'll give you my final conclusions. Okay, so Resident Evil Village. And you can see that the performance so high right now with ray tracing off, although everything else on the maximum preset is so high that I'm actually facing a slight CPU bottleneck that gets worse depending on the scene that I'm looking at. This one here is fairly demanding, so at least mostly GPU bottlenecked. And the performance up there is way beyond most people's monitor refresh rate up here, currently at 189 frames per second. So we obviously have some room to kick on some ray tracing. So in this game, if you use the ray tracing preset, it's actually not maximum settings plus ray tracing. So I would go with the maximum preset and then we're gonna kick on some ray tracing. So I just turned ray tracing on. And now we need to scroll back down and see what it actually did, okay? And make sure all of them turned on. Okay, so it looks like we've got ray tracing on, global illumination and reflection, so you have some options here, low, medium, and high. Light reflections, we have options high, low, medium, and ambient occlusion sets it off unless we turn it on. So why don't we start out with what it did on its own, and then ambient occlusion will turn on if it seems like we have room for it. Okay, so here, wow, actually our frame rate is still extremely high. We're at over 100 frames per second in this scene. Again, this is not the least demanding scene in the game or anything like that. So yeah, let's go ahead and kick on that ambient occlusion. I think we do have room for it. So ambient occlusion is right here, kicking that on. And, well, I mean, frame rate's still really good. We're around 100 frames per second. So I think the conclusion here is you can absolutely maintain a very high, very smooth frame rate in Resident Evil Village with absolute maximum settings, including maxing out the ray tracing settings. Now, I'll also mention that if you wanted to, you could even use FSR in this game. So we can even go to the settings and go to FSR, Fidelity FX Super Resolution, and we could even kick on Ultra Quality, which looks very close to native. And if we do that, you'll notice that our frame rate bumps up now into the around the 120s, 130s range. But I did select this particular scene to show you something. This grass does look noticeably worse with FSR on. I'll show it to you again. It's certain things like that. Most things in the game still look very good. But if I kick the FSR back off, I think you can see a noticeably improved sharpness in the grass. Now, most things, again, are going to be less noticeable than that. So like if you're looking at these bricks here, so it really depends on what you're looking at, how it impacts the performance. So, I'm sorry, the image quality. not performance. So if we go to ultra quality here, the bricks still look pretty good. Now notice that with the ultra quality on, if you're trying to get like a, 120, 140 frames per second kind of a performance, you want to cap out your frame rate, this is definitely going to help. But like I said, in my opinion, due to in this particular game, the noticeable things like the grass with the FSR, I would probably leave it off just because we're still getting really good performance here, even without that. Okay, here we are in Control, and currently the graphics are set to their highest preset at 1440p. We can see that at least in this scene, I seem to be doing real well. We're up in the 90s in terms of frame rate, and so maybe there's a little bit of headroom for ray tracing. Let's see what happens. So, options, display, and we got some ray tracing settings. Now, one of the most obviously visible ray tracing effects is the reflections. So let's kick that on and see what happens. You should be able to immediately notice this puddle in front of me is reflecting some lights that it was not reflecting previously with ray tracing off. Although you can also now notice that our frame rate is down into the low 60s rather than being in the high. Whoa, had a little spike there. Don't know what that was. We seem to have recovered and are back into the 60s. I don't know if that was ray tracing related or just, the game stuttering as it loaded something in. But hey, we seem to maintain in the 60s with these better reflections, at least in this scene. Do we have some headroom to go a little bit farther? So let's go ahead and add in, so what are their presets here? So if we do medium, they would add in the transparent reflections next. So let's see. We're definitely seeing a bit more of a performance hit, but it is quite subtle. We are now really just a couple frames difference. Now I'm guessing that there are scenes with more transparencies to add in more transparent reflections too, that would take a harder hit by enabling that. But in this particular scene where I happen to be in the game right now, guys, I need to get back and finish this. I sort of just stopped playing it a long time ago. I enjoyed it though, I don't know why I stopped. Let's kick it on to high, and that just adds everything. Well, let's see what happens, then maybe turn a little bit more of it off. Okay, I mean, we're in the 40s. Now, the 40s in a game that involves shooting, so I'm actually aiming at things, to me is too low. I would not take that sacrifice. But in the mid to upper 40s, some people, especially if you have a variable refresh rate monitor, kind of helping smooth things out a bit, might find that acceptable, but honestly, not for me, not for the difference that we're getting here. What if we took off, the ray traced debris, peel things back a little bit? What happens? I'm not sure there's really any debris going on in this scene, so yeah, it doesn't look like we're seeing too much of a difference there, if there's any difference at all. What if we peel back the contact shadows? Okay, letting that stabilize. Okay, that did give us a little bit of frame rate back. We're now into the upper 40s and sometimes the 50s as we kind of walk around and look at different scenes in this room. Fine, I would argue that might be acceptable if you really, really wanted that, diffused lighting. But again, if we just stick to the reflections, or in other words, the medium ray tracing preset, it does appear that at least in a scene like this, we can maintain in the 60s. Now, I'm not sure personally it'd be worth it, but hey, looks like it happens. A few dips here as I run into some other areas just to test it out. So it looks like we're at least staying in the mid to upper 50s and the 60s, at least in the area of the game that I'm in. Okay, so Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition is an interesting example of a game where, to my understanding, this version of the game is always at least somewhat ray traced. And let me show you the graphics options for what I'm talking about here. So we're at 1440p, the normal settings are set to ultra, but then if we go down here, the ray tracing settings just have normal, high, and ultra, there's no off setting. And reflections have hybrid and ray traced, and my understanding of the word hybrid would be that it would be combining some ray tracing with some not ray tracing. So setting ray tracing to normal and hybrid is as low as it goes. If you're curious, the other graphic settings, I just left everything at the defaults that it went to when I put it on the ultra setting and loaded up the game. So it does have variable rate shading to 2x, it does have Hairworks off and advanced physics off, tessellation on, and shading rate at 1.0. So here's the performance we're getting with basically ray tracing as low as it goes, but the normal settings at ultra, and you can see that we are well over 100 frames per second and things are looking good. And again, my understanding is that this already includes at least some minimal amount of ray tracing. If we kick ray tracing up to high, let's see what happens to our frame rate. Get second to process there, and hey, ray tracing didn't do a whole heck of a lot turning up to high, at least in this scene. Now I will run around and see if we can find anything more demanding, but for now, let's just kick on some more settings and see how it's going. Ray tracing up to ultra. And okay, we are still in the 90s, at least in this scene. Now I'm assuming we will be able to run around and find something a bit more demanding than this, but things are looking very good so far in terms of the ray tracing performance. Let's switch reflections up from hybrid to ray traced, and that's about all the ray tracing that we are able to turn on in this game. Okay, now the reflections had a big hit here. Now I am also at a scene with water, which I'm assuming is, reflecting a lot of things. But we're still in the 80s. Frame rate is looking good. Let's run up to the train. I've noticed that by the camp out by the train tends to be a pretty demanding place in this game, at least when I actually played the game on my RTX 2070. I haven't actually loaded this up on my 6800 XT until just now. Okay, right here. So at the actual train, staring at it, we are dropping to the 60s. So it does look like you will see some more demanding scenes in the game, but in terms of running around the open world, things look extremely promising. And I've got to say, this is with all the ray tracing settings maxed out, the 6800 XT is doing a dang good job. Although, like I said, if you don't have the reflections on, it did seem to have a big impact on the performance. Let's go ahead and test out some other games. Okay, in Cyberpunk right now, we can see in this fairly demanding scene that we're already only at about 80 frames per second, sometimes dropping into the 70s depending on, the traffic driving by and all of that. This is currently just at the ultra settings with no ray tracing turned on. So let's go ahead and kick on some ray tracing. So if we kick on ray traced reflections, let's just see what happens. Takes a second for it to process, so give it a second here. Okay, so with just ray traced reflections turning on, you can see that our frame rate's already very low, down into the 40s. Now you can see that on certain surfaces, these are the ray traced reflections. It makes a huge difference in the reflections on certain surfaces, so it is very noticeable. Although it's not like the game looked significantly bad without that turned on. So let's go ahead and try out some other combinations of ray traced settings. So first, let's try these things one at a time and see what performance they have. So if I turn off the reflections, but I turn on ray traced shadows, okay, you can see that we're now in the 50s. So the shadows are clearly having less of a performance impact than the reflections did. So you might be more willing to play with ray traced shadows on than with the reflections turned on. Although, what you get in terms of how noticeable it is might not be quite as much. So now let's turn the shadows and reflections off, but let's kick the ray traced lighting up to medium and see what happens. Ooh, ray traced lighting seems quite demanding. We're in the 40s here. And again, that was with the other ray trace settings turned off. Now that was even just down to medium. If we go ahead and bump it up to ultra, let's see where we settle in. Okay, we are now into the 30s. So we are, yeah, seriously struggling here. And we could go ahead and bump it up one setting further, although I do believe that if I remember correctly, that's the Psycho that is pretty demanding on just about any ray tracing card. And yeah, that drops us down to a nice even, well, I was gonna say 30, but then we got bumped and dropped into the 20s. Okay, so I'm gonna say that the Psycho lighting is probably out for us. And then we'll see, okay, so what could we do here? Maybe we wanted some medium lighting, some shadows on. Let's see what happened if we just kind of went with that combo. Okay, so we're in the 30s. This isn't great. Let's see if there's anything we could do if we wanted to go with that combo. Now, one thing that you can do, this game doesn't have FSR, but it does have some resolution scaling, except that apparently it doesn't work with ray tracing on. I think it used to. Perhaps this is a bug. We could try just a straight up dropping the resolution a bit, but I don't know, guys. Well, there are mods and Steam programs that can allow you to apply FSR to games that don't support it. But I've got to say, unless you're looking for a 30 frames per second kind of experience, I guess it's looking like in the current state of things, you might want to just, if you do any ray tracing at all, it seemed like the shadows were the only one that didn't seem to have a big enough impact to be kind of dropping you to the 30s or the 40s pretty badly. This still feels fairly playable if you have a variable refresh rate monitor that can kind of keep things smooth. But again, my personal opinion here would be I'd probably just play this with ray tracing off. Still looks great, and you're getting the much better frame rate. Okay, so this is Doom Eternal, and we currently have it on Ultra Nightmare with no ray tracing, and you can see that we are well over 200 frames per second. Now I'm gonna enter some combat here, and I can imagine that we'll get a few little drops here and there, but we're still, like, again, we hit 300 there. Now again, it's not the most intense combat in the world. We clearly have some room to play with. So let's go ahead and click the ray tracing on. If I remember right, this game simply has a ray tracing on or off setting, and we don't get to mess around with anything other than that. So we applied the changes, and let's load things up. All right, ray tracing is now on, and you can see that while our frame rate took a huge hit, we're still in the 140, 150 range. Let me do a little more combat here, because I've noticed that the frame rate in this game can change quite a bit based on what is happening on the screen and how much combat there is, all of that. But it is looking like throughout this fight, have we dropped below 120? I mean, we did there for a split second, but we're well above 100 frames per second. So it's looking like at 1440p, we can absolutely stay over 100 frames per second, even in combat with the ray tracing on, everything else at Ultra Nightmare. This one looks good. Okay, here we are in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I have everything on the highest graphical preset, but so far without ray tracing. And we can see that the GPU is absolutely crushing it at 150 something frames per second in this scene. Now, this was one of the earliest, maybe the earliest, I can't quite remember, ray tracing titles. So it's maybe not a good example of absolutely newest modern ray tracing, but it did have ray traced shadows with a few different settings. So if we jump up to medium, it tells us that this enables shadows for selected points of light. Let's try that out and see what happens. And we've only gone down to, okay, 138 for a second there, but now back up to 144. Now it's done processing those rays. So we barely lost anything, at least in this particular room. So it looks like having a little bit of ray traced shadows here should not be a big deal. If we jump on up to the high settings, which it describes as saying high will enable additional spot and directional lights, including the sun, replacing traditional shadow maps, we can go ahead and see what happens now. Okay, not too much. So maybe we should step outside. It did say it added the sun now. So hey, this is Tomb Raider, so I was, in a tomb type setting, but let's actually pop out into the sunlight. We're noticing my frame rate dipping here, but this is a scene where I'm actually heavily CPU bottlenecked due to the city. So you can actually see, okay, that our GPU usage is near the top, but we're still actually almost maxing out my CPU as well as my GPU here. So I apologize, guys. I've got an i5 9600K. Need to upgrade that thing, I guess. But it's looking like even at high, we're still, you know, I'm at 88 right now, 85, 80. We dipped into the 70s there for a second, but like I said, some of that could be some CPU issues. And hey, we're in the sunlight, and game still feels pretty smooth. Let's go ahead and check out what the highest possible ray trace setting does here. So Ultra improves on this by adding translucent shadows and additional rays for a higher quality result at a significant performance cost. So kicking that on here, giving it a second to settle things down. And you know what? At least in this scene, I've gotta say, we're still above 60 frames per second. Running around here a bit. Okay, a couple of dips into the 50s, okay, into the 40s. So we did find some areas where this absolute highest setting does seem to be a little bit much. So maybe this is the translucent shadows in the water here. Perhaps that's what we're looking at. So if we drop it back down again to the high setting rather than the ultra setting, let's see how we do in this scene. Yeah, it looks like it was the translucent shadows. I'm guessing that's what was going on here. In this scene with the ray tracing shadows on high, we are still in the 70s and the 80s. And so I would say that it seems like we can definitely get ray tracing at high for the shadows here, and the frame rates still stay well above 60, and could be pretty smooth if you want to make that trade-off for, you know, slightly better shadows, I guess. Well, what do you guys think? Is that acceptable ray tracing performance for the 6800 XT? I think, for the most part, well, kind of yes. If, like I said, the main reason you're buying the card is high refresh rate rasterized performance, can you then play a little bit of single player stuff with the graphics settings cranked and even throw on a bit of ray tracing? We saw titles like Doom Eternal where you're still well over 100 frames per second with ray tracing on. We saw Resident Evil Village that apparently didn't have that demanding of ray tracing because even without FSR, we were still cranking the high frame rates. In maybe an older game like Tomb Raider, you could have some shadows turned on, maybe not the ultra shadows, but medium or high still seemed pretty good. Although in some other games, like Cyberpunk, I mean, we are really getting punished on that frame rate. You might be able to kick on a little bit of shadows or something if you're willing to take that sacrifice. It might not be worth it. So again, I don't need to summarize all the testing you just watched, but basically I would say it's usable with some ray tracing in most of the games that I tested. Definitely not maximum ray tracing in all of those games, but again, that's not really why you're buying the card in the first place if you're choosing this over the 3080, unless you did it like me because it was a money thing. What do you guys think about it in the comment section? Let me know, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.